I'll never forget one of the first times that I experienced real fear. I was probably about 9 or 10 years old, and sometime in the months prior to this particular event, my church had watched a movie called A Thief in the Night. Some of you who are getting ancient like myself might remember that movie. It came out in 1972. We watched it at church. Which was a big deal back then, and probably about a year or so later. And so I was about 9 or 10 years old. This movie was about the second coming, and it followed the life of a gentleman who came to Christ after he almost died from being bit by a snake, because he worked at the zoo. It is actually a cobra, which, as I'm thinking about it, is probably where I got my other fear, the fear of snakes. Don't bring them around. But he got bit by this snake, almost died, recovered, and came back and committed his life to the Lord. And soon after, he and millions of other people disappeared in an instant because Christ returned. His wife, on the other hand, did not. And the rest of the movie kind of follows the chaos that happened with those that were left behind. Now, my fear wasn't in watching the movie. My fear, as I said earlier, came a few months later when I came home from school one day, expecting to find my mom and my sister at home. You can understand, my mom was never gone after school. And that morning, she was gone, and I had in my mind that I'd been left behind. Jesus had come back. And I can tell you, in those few minutes between the time that I got home and the time my mom got home, which could have been 2 minutes or 2 hours, I have no idea, no recollection, but I can tell you in those few minutes, I experienced a fear like I'd not ever experienced before. The fear that I was now alone, the fear that I had been rejected by God Himself. And while I was very relieved to discover that I hadn't been left behind when my mom got home, that experience impacted me deeply. Now, I know it was just a movie, and it wasn't a very well done one at that. I actually found it online. I was going to give you a little clip, but you don't want to go there. You think Christian movies are bad acting today? 1972, they were miserable. But my 9-year-old mind, it was my reality that day that I'd been left behind. And in some ways, I think it was really a catalyst for my tendency to be a fearful person today. I may not come across as such, but in all honesty, to this day, fear and worry and anxiety plague me a whole lot more than I ever care to admit. And I struggle with that fear of being alone, that fear of rejection. After all, being left behind is kind of the ultimate rejection. That fear of being forgotten. And each of those things today, really in my life, as we're going to talk today, are giants in my life that I have fought for most of my life. But the reality is that I'm fairly sure that I'm not the only one here to have giants that they have battled or are currently battling. As a matter of fact, I know that there are many here probably who experience some of the same fears I do. The fear of being alone, the fear of being rejected, or some of the other giants such as anger and anxiety and addiction. All giants that we kind of battle over and over that just won't seem to ever die. They won't go away. The battle just seems like it's never gonna be won. Well, not long ago, I came across an incredible book that has really helped challenge me greatly and has helped to begin to at least change my perspective regarding some of my giants. The book is called Goliath, Must Fall. It's written by Louis Giglio, who's the pastor at Passion City Church. Some of you have probably, I remember in some Sunday school classes, have watched some of his videos, which are just amazing in and of themselves. But he wrote this book, and actually we're going to use this in my class on Wednesday nights starting this fall sometime, and so I'd love to have you be a part of it. If you can't wait till then, I do have some copies of this book that are very cheap. I got a good deal like I did with the other one, and so if you wanted a copy earlier than the fall, I'd be happy to get that for you. But some of the things that I've been learning in this book have been so good that I couldn't wait until then to begin to share it with you. And so today I want to provide you kind of a sort of teaser to the book, some of the things that the ideas that Louis shares in helping to deal with some of the giants in our lives. And so if you would, turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17, that is in the Old Testament. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now we are first introduced to David, and we're going to talk about this very familiar story. Probably all of us have heard it at some point or another. Even non-Christians have heard this, the story of David and Goliath. And we're introduced to David shortly after Saul is rejected as the king of Israel. And under God's leading and guidance, the prophet Samuel travels to the home of a man named Jesse to anoint one of Jesse's sons as the next king of Israel, though he's not told specifically which son he's to anoint. And so he arrives, and he's greeted by Jesse and his sons, and they're all good-looking, strong young men that in Samuel's eyes, man, they would all contain some sort of characteristic to make a great king here for Israel. And so again, under God's guidance, he begins to go down the line of Jesse's sons, starting with the oldest and going all the way down to the youngest, ready to anoint one of those guys as the next king of Israel. But he gets to the seventh son, which is the last one that was present, and God still hasn't confirmed that any of these kids is the next king. So he's getting a little flustered, I'm sure, and he asks Jesse, hey, are there any others? Are you sure they're all here? We've forgotten any. Is there anybody else? And almost as an afterthought, Jesse says, oh, yeah, but the youngest is out tending the sheep. You don't, in other words, really don't want to bother with him. He's just a shepherd. Don't worry about it. But Samuel says, no, we're going to stay here until you go get him. And we're not even going to sit down until he gets here. And so somebody runs down, probably one of his brothers, which made them mutter and sputter all the way down to going to get him. They bring him back, and as soon as David comes, Samuel is told by God, this is the one. This is the next king of Israel. And so Samuel anoints David as that next king. And the Bible says that immediately the Holy Spirit came powerfully upon David from that point on. But what's interesting is that you would expect there to be some sort of celebration at this point. I mean, after all, David has been anointed the king. Surely there's going to be a big party. But what happens is that as soon as Samuel finishes anointing David, he leaves. And David, it appears, just kind of goes back to tending his sheep. And the only movement we see in David's life for the next 5 years or so is that in addition to his continuing those duties as a shepherd, he does at some point begin to serve Saul. Saul is still the king, but he serves him as an armor bearer and as a kind of a background musician of sorts to kind of calm Saul's nerves as he gets on the edge of insanity. And you read through Samuel, and you'll see Saul's insanity quite often. But David's not king. He's still just basically a shepherd boy, and it doesn't look like there's anything that's going to change that anytime soon. So that's where we come to in 1 Samuel 17. In verse 1, it says, Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Sokoh in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes-Dammim between Soko and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill, and the Israelites occupied another, with a valley in between them. And a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like that of a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath was a scary guy. 6 cubits in a span, that's almost 9 feet tall. And he was from Gath. He was a descendant of Bannach, and the Anakites were described by the spies who went to check out the land of Canaan. You'll remember 10 of them came back, and they described the occupants as giants and formidable warriors. They were, it said, descendants of the Nephilim, which, as you look back in the Old Testament, they were some big guys, some scary guys. And Goliath was one of them. Again, he was about 9 feet tall. He wore 125 pounds of armor. That didn't include his shield, because they had the little scrawny whoever went in front of him. 125 pounds. So not only is he tall and big, he's wearing a whole lot of armor. And then it says that he was a champion. Twice here it says that Goliath was a champion. In other words, this wasn't his first rodeo. He'd won a few of these things before. He'd come out and gotten John Cena or whoever a few times down on the mat. And he had taken care of it a lot. So he came out and he was a champion. When I think of Goliath, I kind of think of Rocky meets General Maximus, meets William Wallace, meets Optimus Prime. Big and scary, somebody you would not want to meet in a dark alley. So Goliath is this scary guy. Verse 8, it says, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." And on hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. And in verse 16 it says, "For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand." Goliath was being defiant. He was being intimidating. Every day, day after day after day after day, he'd come out there and he would taunt them, and he would ridicule them, and he would challenge them, and he would defy their God. And then verse 12, it says, "Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The first was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep." Verse 17, "Now Jesse said to his son David, 'Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them.' There with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle position, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. And David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. And as he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. And whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Again, David was the youngest of 8 boys, and he'd been going back and forth, tending sheep, to bringing supplies, to occasionally playing the harp for Saul. And on this particular occasion, David is sent by his father to bring more supplies to 3 of his brothers. And while he's there, he heard this blatant, defiant taunt from Goliath. And what he heard started to make his blood boil. So he's looking around, and he's like, nobody hear what this guy is saying? Are you not going to do anything? You're just going to stand there? So David kind of brings it up to one of the other soldiers, and his brother, the oldest brother, Eliab, overhears the conversation. If you go to verse 28, it says, when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here, and with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. Kind of strange coming from your own brother. But I have to wonder if he had some issues with David that extended way beyond his presence there that day with Goliath. I mean, think about it. Eliab had been passed over by Samuel to be the next king. He'd been passed over, and then he passed over all the other ones. In his words here to David sound like there's a little bitterness involved between he and David. Even though David's not the king, even though it doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon, Eliab is a little furious with him. But fortunately, David did what most brothers do, and he ignored him. He turned to someone else, and that person ultimately put him into contact with Saul, and Saul, or David tells Saul, hey, if no one else is willing to do this, I will go and I will fight this guy and I will take him out. Doesn't matter that I'm out a soldier. God, says David, is my strength, and I'll do it. And at that point, to prove his worth to Saul, he kind of gives him his resume. He says, you know what? When I was a shepherd in the fields, I protected my sheep all the time, and there was one time a lion came, there was another time a bear came, and I killed them both with my bare hands and took them out. That seems to be enough for David, because that's probably more than any of the soldiers were doing at that point. So he says, okay, go ahead, go fight Goliath, and Saul tries to fit him with his armor, and David says, no, I don't need this. It's a little clunky. God's called me to do this. He's going to give me the strength. I'm just going to go out. And we find David going out. He picks up those 5 smooth stones that we've sung about since we were kids. He puts one in a sling, and he places it in there, and he hurls it at Goliath, and it meets the mark of Goliath's forehead, and Goliath falls to the ground dead. And Israel is delivered that day. Now, we've heard, again, this story time and time again. We've heard it since we were little kids in Sunday school and at VBS. We've heard it in sermons and Bible studies. We've seen it on television and in movies. David, the scrawny little shepherd boy, goes and takes down the mighty Goliath. And it is an awesome story, especially as a little kid, filled with adventure and the age-old story of good triumphing over evil. But I have to wonder, why does God include the story of David and Goliath for? What is the purpose of it? Is it just to serve as that wonderful story for kids? Is it just to give us a picture of that good versus evil thing? You see, I'm a firm believer that the Bible isn't just a compilation of good stories. God has something for each of us to learn on every page and in every story. And here in the David and Goliath story, I think he's given it to us not so that we could simply be encouraged by a wonderful story, but so that we could see that it is indeed possible for Goliath to be taken down. That it is indeed possible for Goliath to be taken down. But you know, as I've been reading this book, the lesson for me that I've learned, I think the lesson for all of us, is not what we've grown up believing it to be. What we've grown up being taught and believing is that if I have the courage and if I stand up to Goliath, then I can take him down all on my own. But I think instead the lessons are found in what Louis calls three twists in the story. Three twists that really help to frame the discussion that will take place in fighting the different kinds of giants later on. And so twist number one, and this one really was a big one for me. Twist number one is we are not David in the story. We are not David in the story of David and Goliath. And I know, as it did with me, that comes as a surprise for some of us. I mean, after all, as kids, we are taught that we can be David, that we can conquer and slay our giants, that all we need is a little bit of courage, a few stones, and then all we need to do is start swinging. And we can take Goliath down. And every time we would hear that, we'd get fired up, and we'd say, yes, we can do this, and we'd go home, and we'd be convinced that we could take down all the giants in our lives. But what would happen? We'd fail. And we'd find that our giant was still taunting us. Might get knocked out for a little bit. One stone knocked him silly for a while, but somehow he starts to get back up. And he's there again, facing us as we faced them over and over and over again, and it seems like nothing makes the difference. Why is that? Because you see, we were never David in this story. We were never the scrawny little kid who ran out to face Goliath with nothing more than a sling and some stones. We are the David who tried to put on Saul's armor. We are the one who keeps trying to go into battle with Saul's armor on. And we are the Israelites standing on the sidelines doing nothing, frozen in place because we're so scared of that giant. But we aren't David. Jesus is David. God wasn't going to fight this battle in the way man would fight it. God was going to do it in a way that showed his power. You see, the father, Jesse, sent his son David to the front lines to supply his brothers. God sent his son, Jesus, in Bethlehem, by the way, which is the same pastures that David tended sheep. God sent Jesus to come supply us with what we could not do on our own. And so just as David stepped out in the power of God to kill Goliath, Jesus steps out in the power of God to fight our giants for us. Jesus is David. And this brings another interesting thing as you read through this story. How many days did Goliath taunt the Israelites? Verse 16, for 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took a stand. Now in the Bible, in addition to 40 meaning 40, he says 40 days, it was probably 40 days. But in addition to that, often 40 in the Bible reflects and represents days of trial and distress followed by deliverance. You look in the Old Testament, when God destroyed the earth with a flood, what happened? It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. When Moses killed the Egyptian, he fled to Midian. and where he spent 40 years in the desert before he returned to Egypt to deliver God's people. The Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years before they went into Canaan and began to see their deliverance. Before Samson came along, Israel served the Philistines, it says, for 40 years. And when Elijah fled from Jezebel, those in Susan's class, how many days and nights did he travel to Mount Horeb? 40 days and nights. In the New Testament, just prior to his beginning of ministry, Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness, being tempted by Satan, being sustained by God and the power of his word, and then setting out to begin to deliver God's people. That number 40 represents trial followed by deliverance. And what I find interesting, what Louis talks about it here in the book, is that David didn't come on day 28. He didn't come on day 39 or day 56. David showed up on day 40. Why did he do that? I think he did so that we would recognize that Jesus was showing up, ready to deliver his people from the giants in their lives. David says in verse 46, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head." Jesus kind of said the same thing to Satan several years later, except he stomped on his. It's not the work of man, it's the work of God. You see, God isn't asking us to take down our giants by ourselves. He simply wants us to understand that Jesus is David, and he has come into our story to face our giants and to take them down for us. I think that's good news. And how many of us have spent our lifetimes attempting to take down our own giants? How many of us have kept telling ourselves, if only I could have a little bit more courage, if only I could throw a few more stones, then surely something is going to connect and I am going to kill that giant once and for all. But friends, Jesus is David, and he is the one who will fight our giants. And that should give us great hope. Twist number 2, David's motivation was God's glory. You see, David wasn't personally at risk here. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't have to do anything. Nobody expected him to do anything. He was there to drop off supplies, and if it were me, I would have likely heard Goliath and heard what he had to say, and I would have said, "Here are your supplies. I will see you later." That's all that was expected of him. But David's relationship with God was paramount. And what he heard from Goliath motivated him, because Goliath was sending curses to his God. And so had Goliath simply just been taunting the Israelites, I'm sure it wouldn't have mattered to David and he would have gone home, but he wasn't. Goliath was taunting God. And he couldn't stand by and do nothing about it. Because David loved God. David loved God, and he wasn't there because he ought to be there. He was there just to deliver supplies. But David's relationship with God, a relationship that was forged in the daily grind of protecting his sheep, David knew God. He knew God's power. He knew God's majesty. Read a few of the Psalms. How majestic is your name, the skies, the animals, everything. He recognized who God was going into this. And as a result, he was driven by that motivation to fight Goliath. He did want Israel's freedom. Don't mistake that. But God's glory was his primary concern. And so just like David wanted Israel to be free, God wants you to be free from your giants. And if there's something that's holding sway over you, that some fear or addiction or circumstance, God does want to deliver you from that. He does want to take that down. That's what deliverance is all about. But as Lou reminds us, he says, if we're not careful, if we don't see the full story, we will get God to participate with us to give us freedom, and we'll forget that we are participating with God to give God glory. It says we will turn the gospel around and we'll say, God, I need you to come into my situation and take down my giants so I can be free and live the life that I want to. And we forget that God does want to come into our situation, and he does want to take down our giants, and he does want to cause us to live the life that he wants us to live. But he wants to do so that his name is glorified, that his name is exalted above every other name. He wants people in our world to look at what he's done in our lives and say, your God is the God. There is no doubt. Friends, our freedom and God's glory, Louis says, are inextricably wound together. They are always present at the same time. It says Jesus gave his life on the cross to what? To set us free. But he also gave his life on the cross to glorify God. He broke our chains so that God could be glorified. So that the world would know that there was only one God. There was no other. It wasn't just for our freedom. Jesus died to free us in order to glorify God. They both happen at the same time. And when my motivation is only half of that equation, when my motivation is only my freedom, then we miss half of the motivation. God wants us to come to the point where we understand that when we are fighting for our freedom, we are also standing for God's glory. When we don't do that, we are allowing that giant to convince us that he is bigger than Jesus. And we need to remind ourselves that our God is bigger than our giant. And we do that so God's glory isn't diminished as a result. David's motivation was God's glory. And then it says in verse 48 through 50, it says, as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David, and again, this isn't me, David ran quickly toward the battle. Quickly toward the battle. Again, I would have been quickly the other way. Quickly toward the battle. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. Twist number 3, your giant is dead. Your giant is dead. This is sometimes, I think, hard for us to grasp and hard for us to really comprehend at the end of the day, because we would argue that it appears that our giant is still very much alive and well. That we just fought our giant this morning. That we just stood toe-to-toe with that giant earlier. And that may be true. And this is where we need to remember that Jesus' work on the cross defeated the enemy. He defeated the enemy and rendered Satan powerless. Jesus finished the work. It is done, and it doesn't ever need to be done again. Which means that every time we face a giant, Jesus doesn't come to us and say, oh, you're facing another giant today, then I need to go back to the cross, and I need to die for your giant again, and I need to rise for your giant again. It doesn't work that way. Jesus finished the work once for all time. So our giant is dead. Your giants are dead. But again, we ask ourselves, then why is it that my giant is still alive? But while your giant is indeed dead, it can still be deadly. Let me share with you, and I love how Louis illustrates this, although he illustrates it with my other fear. He says, during summers as a kid, I used to go to youth camp with my church. We went to Hilton Head, South Carolina, but not to stay in some fancy condominium by the ocean. We stayed at the Presbyterian campground, situated on a tract of land on the other side of the main road from the ocean, in an area that could most appropriately be called jungle-esque. When I say jungle-esque, I mean the campground was definitely a wild land overgrown with swampy forests. This was the 1970s, long before most of the modern developments of Hilton Head Island had been built. The island itself is maybe 60 square miles. And to reach camp, we turned off the main road into a smaller driveway that led us inside the grounds. The campground was comprised of a dining hall and kitchen with the expected tetherball pole. I remember those. I hadn't even thought of that until I read that. Those tetherball poles, you younger kids are missing something. That was the iPhone of the 1970s, man. It'd keep you occupied for hours because it always came back. And then the 4-square court lined on the entry wood floor. A rustic chapel that seated about 100 people. There were 5 girls' cabins and 5 guys' cabins located on opposite sides of the field, of course. Along one-lane sandy trail led from the main area to the cabins. It was fine during the day, but we wouldn't walk it at night without a flashlight. In the middle of each cabin cluster was a bathhouse, and bathhouses didn't have doors or windows. The bathhouses were completely vulnerable to the elements. That's where the fun started. At night, if you needed to go to the bathroom, you had to traipse outside your cabin and scamper down the path to reach the bathhouse. You never knew what sort of wildlife might be lurking on the way. Lizards ran the place. Spiders were ever present. And then there were snakes. Lots of snakes, poisonous snakes. You'd hope you didn't encounter one on the way to the bathhouse at night, or worse, one would already be in the stall. At the start of each week, a handful of skittish kids would take one glance at those bathrooms and make the dubious decision not to make the journey at night, no matter what the cost. One of the jobs for the counselors during the off weeks was to spread lime around each of the cabin areas. Snakes apparently hate lime. We wanted to let these snakes know we were here and they didn't want to mess with us. They could have their territory, we could have ours. And if all went well, they'd get the idea we were here to stay for a while, and they'd go back to do whatever it was that they did and wherever they came from, and everything would be peaceful. Sometimes the lime proved an effective blocker, and sometimes it didn't. When campers started spotting too many snakes on the bathroom trail, that meant we counselors needed to up the ante. On weekends, when campers were gone, my best friend Andy Stanley and I took matters into our own hands. We just want the girls to feel safe excuse to go out hunting with another buddy or two. We wanted to let the snakes know we weren't kidding around. These were poisonous snakes, keep in mind, fully capable of seriously hurting us. Our hunts went like this. Once it got dark, snakes like to move when the weather cooled, we'd head out into the overgrown areas between the cabins with a flashlight in one hand and a baseball bat in the other. We spread out about 10 to 15 feet from one another, and we slowly moved through the ankle-high growth. It never took too long before we'd find our prey. Bingo, a 3-foot-long copperhead would cruise through the grass in front of us. Our technique of doing away with snakes wasn't uber sophisticated. This was absolutely low-level combat. We were teens and didn't really think this plan through. For crying out loud, we had on shorts and tennis shoes. No steel-toed boots, no leg protectors. But once we spotted a prey, we'd glance around to make sure the copperhead's brother wasn't right behind him. Then we'd take our baseball bat and smack the snake on the head. Bam. Then we'd hit it 50 more times on the head just to make sure the job was done right. He said it's amazing how focused your aim can be when a snake bite is likely if you miss. He said once that snake was good and dead, we'd press the end of the barrel down on what was left of the snake's head. There's nobody from PETA here, is there? We'd put that barrel down on what was left of the snake's head. We'd grab the snake's body and we would yank hard. The snake's head would snap off and we'd grind it further down into the sandy soil and bury it with more sand. Now what to do? You can't exactly leave the rest of the snake lying in the grass. That would cause one of the other guys to panic in a later moment, not knowing the snake was finished. So we'd swallow hard, pick up the headless snake by the tail, then we'd go on to look for the next snake. After an hour, we'd each have a dozen dead snakes in one hand while we tried to juggle the flashlight and baseball bat with the other. If you don't like snakes and are going to have nightmares, then close your ears. Because he said a funny thing about dead snakes. The head might be gone, but the snake's body will continue to squirm a long time afterward. So we'd be walking around in the woods at night with a mess of dead snake bodies crawling all over our arms. We all tried to be cool, but it personally gave me the willies. I'd remind myself the snakes weren't actually alive. I bonked them on that head. I ground its head in the dirt. I yanked the head off. I buried it. The snake is dead, Louis. The snake is dead. And then when our snake hunting expedition was over, we'd walk to the center of camp where the dining room and chapel were. We'd pile up the bodies, and they'd keep writhing in a little headless pile for a while. I don't remember what we did with them after that, probably some sort of teenage shenanigans. I could think of what I would have done. I wouldn't have been out there in the first place. Why do I tell this story? Why am I creeping you out with tales of writhing? So there's an important purpose. The danger of dead snakes can actually help us picture some critical truths. He said, when a dead snake's body squirms, it might make the hair on your neck stand up, but that's all it can do. Give you a little scare. Make your blood pressure spike. A dead snake's head, however, can still be extremely dangerous. Back on Hilton Head, we buried the heads of those dead snakes. Why? Because there's still enough venom in the fangs to do serious damage to a person. If you're out walking around in the woods and you step on a dead snake's head, then it's likely enough poison is spring-loaded in a fang where any pressure can release the poison into your foot. That's big trouble. He says Satan was defeated on the cross. The battle's over. The victory has been won. But Satan can still wriggle and squirm and make the hairs on our heads stand up. If we step on Satan's fangs, he can still poison us and cause serious harm. And the poison will diminish our hope and weaken the abundant reality of what our lives in Christ could be. It's a great picture, isn't it? It's a little creepy. But it's a great picture. Satan has been defeated. The victory has been won. But as Louis says, Satan can still wriggle and squirm and make the hairs on our necks stand up. And if we step on those fangs, he can still poison us. He can still cause serious harm. He can diminish our hope and weaken our abundant reality. Friends, our giants are dead, but they can still be deadly. Our giants are dead, but they can still be deadly. It's why the battle appears to keep going. But here's the good news, and it's our challenge for this morning. Worship team, you can come back up. As followers of Jesus, we aren't left defenseless. In addition to the perfectly fitting armor of God that we've talked about over the last few weeks in our fight against the unseen, in addition to that perfectly fitting armor, Peter says and reminds us in 2 Peter 1:3 that God's divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of Him who called us by His own glory and goodness. And so the next time your giant starts wriggling and squirming, remind yourself that not only is he dead, but that Jesus is bigger than whatever it is you're facing. He's already taken down that giant. As hard as it is for us to comprehend that in the midst of a battle, Jesus has already taken down the giant. He's already provided the victory. He's already given us everything that we need to live in victory. As we close this morning, I want to give you an opportunity. If I'd thought of it early enough, I would have gotten each of us a rock. Because whether we realize it or not, we are all carrying rocks ready to fight a Goliath in our life. And what I want to do is the worship team leads and sings again, "Came to My Rescue." I want to offer you the opportunity to come and lay down your rock before the Lord. Turn it over to Him and let Him pick it up. Let Him do the battle. Let Him remind you that He's already taken down our Goliaths. It's just between you and God. So as the worship team sings, you can come and spend some time with the Lord.